Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. The story I'm going to tell you isn't something I found in an archive. It's something I lived through, up in the quiet dark, where the world is just a shimmering blue marble below your feet. I worked for NASA, specifically on the International Space Station, and this happened during my second long-duration mission. You're going to hear about a sealed chamber, something that wasn't on any manifest, tucked away like a memory the station itself was trying to forget. I know, a sealed chamber on the ISS. It sounds like the start of a bad joke, but I promise you, the reality was infinitely worse. This isn't just a story about discovery. It's about existential vertigo, about finding something so fundamentally other that it cracks the very glass of your understanding. You probably won't make it to the end of this one without feeling a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of your room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now in the comments. I like knowing we're sharing this moment, even across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. It started with a routine thermal scan. I was performing diagnostics on the Harmony node, the Node 2 segment, linking the Japanese and European modules, and I noticed an anomaly. Not a catastrophic anomaly. Nothing that tripped a warning light, just a number that didn't make sense in context. The system was reporting a consistent, low-level heat signature coming from a location that, according to the station blueprints, was supposed to be pure, empty structural truss. Specifically, a substructure just beneath the main body of the node, a space designated on early schematics as the auxiliary robotics bay, but which was functionally inaccessible and had been sealed off decades ago, back in the alpha assembly phase. The number was tiny, a persistent 1.5K above ambient. In the vacuum of space, where heat transfer is mostly radiation-based, a consistent, unbudgeted heat source suggests something is either running, degrading, or alive. And nothing was supposed to be running there. I pulled up the long-term historical data, going back through the entire mission lifetime of the station. The thermal ghost was a constant. Since the moment the structure was joined, that subtle warmth had been there, a heartbeat against the cold perfection of the void. Curiosity was the first thing to bloom in the sterile quiet of the module. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the technician's itch, the scientist's cold drive to reconcile the data with reality. Why seal off a useful bay? Why not just vent the airlock and forget it? Why was there still a tiny, low-frequency current drawing power, enough to produce 1.5K of warmth? I began a deep dive into the historical records, but the documentation was a dead end. Every document related to the structure, design logs, maintenance records, decommissioning reports, ended abruptly, just shy of mentioning the final sealing. It was like a chapter had been ripped out of the station's autobiography. I mentioned it to Mission Control, just a casual note in the daily comms check, describing the thermal anomaly and the lack of accessible blueprints. Their response was immediate and subtly chilling. The flight director, a man named Henderson, whose voice was usually steady as granite, had a fractional pause before he spoke. Copy, station. That area is structurally sound. Recommend no further investigation. We'll update the maintenance plan from here. It was a dismissal that felt too firm, too fast. They weren't dismissing me. They were dismissing the space. And that, right there, was the moment my fear started to acquire a shape. The official explanation was always that the module was structurally incompatible with later editions, a relic of an older design philosophy. permanently decommissioned. But I saw the override panel. It was recessed, covered by a bolted-down plate that looked like it had been put there with excessive, almost ritualistic care. The bolts were standard issue, but the plate itself was a dense, inert composite, designed to absorb rather than reflect thermal energy, perhaps, or something else. I spent a whole sleep cycle just watching that plate, floating weightlessly in the near darkness of Node 2. The only illumination was the soft green glow of the ready lights, and the earthshine pouring in from the cupola windows, casting long, slow-moving shadows inside the hall. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know everything. There are truths that are meant to stay suspended, shielded by distance, time, or complexity. But once a number doesn't add up, once the geometry of a situation is wrong, the compulsion to correct the equation becomes overwhelming. I realized I couldn't trust the official channels. Not because I suspected a conspiracy, but because I suspected a mythic or speculative concept. Not a human secret, but a secret of the station itself, a thing accidentally encapsulated and forgotten in the desperate race to assemble the platform. Something had been put there, something that generated its own minute, internal heat, and then the door was welded shut and covered up. The whole assembly sequence, from 1998 onwards, was a chaotic masterpiece, a constant process of improvisation. It's entirely possible something essential, perhaps something that rode up on an early shuttle flight as a critical experiment or a shielding component, was just sealed away. I started planning. I needed to see what was behind the plate, and for that, I needed to override what the system called the alpha-level redundancy seal. I spent 3 days meticulously pulling the schematics, comparing the obsolete wiring of the early Node 2 systems with the current architecture. It was like tracing a forgotten bloodline. I had to go through 5 distinct layers of security protocol, each one requiring a unique, long-deprecated access code that I only found buried deep in the historical maintenance manuals, filed under the euphemism structural integrity test parameters. The codes themselves were complex, not just alphanumeric, but referencing orbital mechanics and specific Keplerian constants, a factual or scientific anchor. The first code was the orbital inclination of the Zarya module on the day it launched, 51.6, multiplied by the inverse of the solar constant on that date. It felt like a lock designed to be impossible to pick by casual curiosity. The smooth, cold silence of the station was my only companion. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of the air scrubbers, the high-frequency whine of the gyrodynes fighting the tiny drag of the residual atmosphere, but underneath it all was a sound I had only just started hearing. A subtle, almost imperceptible low-frequency hum, which I now realized emanated not from the pumps, but from the location of the anomaly, the muted chamber. It felt like the station itself was breathing, and this chamber was its slow, quiet exhale. It was the sound of something contained, but not silenced. And the closer I got to overriding the seal, the more distinct that sound became, an anticipation filling the space around me. I decided I would open it during a comms blackout, a planned maintenance period where all non-essential data transmission was suspended. The only eyes would be mine, and the only witness, the infinite blackness outside the port windows. I was about to violate the first rule of space maintenance. Never troubleshoot a non-critical anomaly that a previous crew sealed off. I knew that, but the small, steady pulse of heat, the geometry of the sealed plate, and the impossible gap in the records had formed an irresistible gravity well around my attention. It was no longer a matter of protocol, It was a pilgrimage into the station's forgotten unconscious. I was preparing to scratch an itch that felt like it was located on the inside of the universe. The moment arrived during the scheduled maintenance window. The station was running on minimal power. The silence was deep, cold, and utterly comprehensive. I floated in Node 2, surrounded by the tangled cabling and the blank faces of dormant monitors, the only light coming from my headlamp and the pale, eternal stare of the stars outside. The air tasted metallic, charged with anticipation. I had my tools, a standard torque wrench, an auxiliary data reader, and the overriding sense that I was committing a necessary, professional transgression. I began by systematically removing the composite plate. The bolts were stiff, designed to resist thermal expansion and stress, and the effort felt disproportionate to the task. As the plate finally separated with a grinding metallic sigh, the low-frequency hum I had been sensing immediately increased in amplitude. It wasn't loud, but it had a physical presence, vibrating through the structure and into the soles of my boots. It felt less like sound and more like a pressure differential. Beneath the plate was the hatch. It wasn't a standard ISS hatch, which are circular, heavy, and complex. This was a smaller, rectangular access panel, roughly 1 meter by half a meter, recessed slightly into the hull. The surface was an absolute, featureless matte black, a material that seemed to drink the light from my lamp, giving off no glare or reflection. It was colder than the surrounding aluminum structure, contradicting the thermal anomaly. The heat, I realized, wasn't coming from the surface of the chamber, but from within it, radiating through the structural supports before it could reach the surface. The exterior was designed to be perfectly insulating, perfectly mute. Now came the real challenge, the unsealing protocol. The 5 security layers I had identified were controlled by an obsolete electromechanical system mounted on the access frame. It wasn't digitally encrypted, it was physically locked down. The locks were sequential, for requiring physical rotation of a mechanism, and the 5th, a keycard slot that had been chemically sealed with a hardened resin. I started on the first lock. It required the torque wrench, and as the mechanism gave way, a puff of condensed air escaped, smelling faintly of ozone and something impossibly old, like dust from a place where air had never circulated. I felt a surge of cold curiosity, pushing the fear back. This was not the standard smell of stale cabin air. This was the residue of deep compression, of decades of confinement. The second and third locks were simpler, requiring the manual input of the 2 unique, long-deprecated access codes I had pulled from the maintenance manuals. As I punched in the numbers, the Keplerian constants, the complex M variable relating to the initial Zarya orbit, the mechanisms clicked, sounding disproportionately loud in the near silence. With each successful input, the low-frequency hum intensified, becoming a pervasive thrum that settled deep in my chest. It was the sound of something waiting, something stirring in its sleep. The 4th lock was a physical challenge. It required bypassing a hydraulic pressure seal that had been bled and crimped. It took brute force and careful application of a specialized wire cutter, a tiny snip that felt like I was severing an artery. The lock sprung free, and now, only the final seal remained, the keycard slot filled with hardened resin. I couldn't simply drill through it. The structure was too sensitive and the resin too dense. I had to soften it. Using a micro-focused thermal laser, I began to delicately heat the resin. It took almost 20 minutes of painstaking work, the resin slowly bubbling and turning transparent, revealing the obsolete interface beneath. The smell became sharper, more acrid, a chemical scent mixed with that strange, old ozone smell. As the final residue vaporized, I used my data reader, which I had previously modified to act as an obsolete keycard emulator, and slipped it into the slot. The machine hesitated for a beat, processing the complex handshake, and then, with a definitive thunk that echoed through the structure, the final lock disengaged. There was no sound of rushing air, no violent decompression. The door remained perfectly flush. I put my hands on the matte black panel and pushed. It didn't swing or slide. It seemed to retract into the surrounding hull material, vanishing along its edges with a perfect, silent grace that defied standard engineering. And then I saw it. The chamber was small, a utility space barely bigger than a large refrigerator, lined with the same light-drinking, matte black material. It was completely empty, save for one thing, suspended dead center in the volume by invisible, perfectly maintained magnetic field dampeners. It was an object, not a box, not a scientific instrument, and certainly not a robotic part. It was approximately cylindrical, maybe half a meter long and 30 centimeters in diameter, but its surfaces were smooth, seamless, and utterly black, like the deepest part of the night sky focused into a solid form. It seemed to absorb light not just passively, but actively, creating a pocket of local darkness around itself. But there was one feature that contradicted the absolute blackness: a slow, rhythmic internal pulse of light, radiating from within the object itself. It was a deep, muted indigo, almost invisible unless you stared at it directly. The light didn't illuminate the chamber. It simply existed within the artifact, bleeding out a subtle, mesmerizing rhythm. One beat every 4.2 seconds. At that moment, the low-frequency hum I had been hearing ceased entirely. The station noises, the gyrodynes, the air scrubbers, suddenly seemed to recede, as if the volume had been turned down on the rest of the universe. Only the pulse remained. My initial feeling of cold curiosity vanished, replaced by a surge of overwhelming fear. It wasn't the fear of danger or contamination. It was the raw, existential terror of confronting something that had no right to exist within the framework of human knowledge. This artifact wasn't built. It looked grown. Its geometry was perfect, its surfaces flawless, but there was an unsettling organic quality to its presence. It didn't belong in a piece of human architecture. It felt like a stone from a parallel world, somehow dropped into our space-time. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the depth of its indifference, or the complexity of the things it allows to simply be. The artifact was silent, inert, yet its mere presence was a monumental challenge to everything I believed about the fundamental principles of space travel and physics. The thermal anomaly, the 1.5 K, suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't waste heat. It was the metabolic cost of being awake. This was a core piece of evidence for a specific speculative concept: the existence of non-baryonic, self-contained energy systems, something akin to a silent, self-aware capacitor drawing energy directly from the vacuum of space, a concept often whispered about in the most esoteric circles of theoretical physics. I brought the auxiliary data reader close to the suspended object. The device was designed to measure everything: gamma radiation, residual magnetism, EM frequencies, and it immediately overloaded. Not with data, but with a total, incomprehensible silence. Every sensor went to zero. The device wasn't picking up a massive signal. It was picking up nothing. The object was creating an absolute local null field, a pocket of anti-information. But then, as I watched the indigo pulse, the data reader flickered back to life, registering a signal that wasn't EM, wasn't thermal, and wasn't gravitational. It was a pattern, a rhythmic discharge that the system could only label as unknown scalar fluctuation. It was the sound of the artifact beginning to speak, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a dying star, that I was the first human to hear it. I maintained my position, tethered just inside the opened access panel, breathing the dry, filtered air, watching the object. The scalar fluctuation signal had stabilized, and the data reader, now running on manual override, began to translate the incomprehensible noise into a series of visual and auditory patterns. It was transmitting a frequency that seemed to bypass my external sensors and go straight to the internal ones, something that resonated not with the electronics, but with the very structure of the module. The sound, translated into an audible range from my headphones, was not a tone or a musical note. It was a rhythmic, complex chime, metallic yet liquid, perfectly repeating every 4.2 seconds, matching the visual indigo pulse. But the underlying structure of the signal, when visualized as a waveform, was horrifyingly precise. It wasn't random noise or simple radiation. It was information. The pattern was both profoundly mathematical and disturbingly biological. At its core, it was a pure sine wave, a near-perfect expression of F, T, equals asin, omega T. But layered over that perfection were small, irregular modulations. These modulations were too structured to be interference and too complex to be accidental. When I applied fractal analysis, the patterns revealed deep, repeating structures, like the branching of a neural network or the complex veins in a leaf. This was the first contact echo, and it was deafeningly silent. I spent the next 3 hours in that absolute vacuum of focus, running every diagnostic I could devise. The artifact didn't react to light, temperature, or even focused magnetic fields. It simply maintained its internal rhythm, the gentle indigo light expanding and retracting, drawing and releasing power in that perfect 4.2-second cycle. But the signal it was emitting began to subtly shift, incorporating elements that seemed responsive to my proximity. Specifically, the fractal complexity of the biological modulations increased whenever I moved, even slightly. It was recognizing the presence of an observer, cataloging my motion in the three-dimensional space of the chamber, weaving my presence into its cosmic utterance. The cold, scientific curiosity I felt was rapidly transitioning into a deep, philosophical awe. This was not a tool or a weapon. It was a sensor, a recording device, a passive organ of observation that had just been switched on after decades of sleep. And then the effect on me began. The steady rhythm of the pulse started to align with my own internal metrics, my heartbeat, my respiratory rate. I found myself instinctively slowing my breathing to match the 4.2-second cycle. As this synchronization deepened, the perception of time began to distort. The 3 hours I spent in the chamber felt simultaneously like 30 minutes and 3 days. I experienced a profound dislocation of memory. Sudden, vivid snapshots of moments from my childhood. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the precise feel of a certain doorknob, the sound of my mother's voice calling me for dinner, erupted in my conscious mind, perfectly clear, flawlessly detailed, yet utterly contextless. They weren't memories I was actively recalling. They felt like memories being read. I began to suspect the artifact wasn't transmitting information out to space. It was absorbing the ambient information field around it, and perhaps around the whole station. It was receiving data, and the rhythmic pulse was the sound of it processing that intake. The mathematical core of the signal, the pure sine wave, was a factual or scientific anchor. The frequency itself was mathematically linked to the h0 Hubble constant, but scaled by a factor of 10x. It was a language rooted in universal constants, a cosmic fingerprint, almost too precise to be coincidence. If I was right, the object was broadcasting a reference frequency derived from the fundamental rate of universal expansion. This deep complexity pointed toward a terrifying mythic concept, the idea of the artifact being a cosmic anomaly, perhaps a silent, dispersed consciousness, something that didn't live in space but was a fundamental property of space, like an ancient god given physical form. The thought chilled me. If it was a natural phenomenon, it meant the universe was far more subtle and communicative than we gave it credit for. If it was built, the builders were operating on a timescale and a level of understanding that made the Apollo program look like children playing with mud. My gaze was locked on the perfect, seamless surface. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how porous the boundary between consciousness and reality actually is. As the pulse thrummed, I felt a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure building behind my eyes, as if my optic nerves were receiving data streams they were never intended to process. The rhythmic discharge on the data reader suddenly resolved itself into a set of coordinates. Not terrestrial coordinates, and not even standard celestial ones, right ascension and declination. These were coordinates based on the x, y, z vectors relative to the galactic core, but they were also overlaid with a fourth variable, tau, the temporal axis. The coordinates were pointing to a location in space and a point in time, a specific intersection millions of years in the past, or perhaps millions of light years away. I didn't need to consult a star map to recognize the celestial position. It pointed directly toward the void, the great cosmic dark, the region of space known as the Boötes Void. It's an immense, spherical region of space estimated to be 250 million light-years across, containing remarkably few galaxies, a vast pocket of pure nothingness, a place where the light simply hasn't bothered to shine. The artifact's signal was a beacon, a record, or perhaps a conversation with that specific location. And as I realized this, the fear solidified into a deep, cold dread. Whatever sealed this chamber 30 years ago wasn't trying to protect the station from the artifact. They were trying to protect the artifact from observation, or perhaps to mute the response it was drawing. I gently reached out with my gloved hand. I didn't touch the object. I couldn't bring myself to break the null field surrounding it, but I placed my hand in the space just beside it. Immediately, the low-frequency chime shifted tone. It became higher-pitched, almost a keening sound, and the geometric pattern on the screen fractured, briefly displaying a cascade of alien symbols, shapes that defied three-dimensional perspective, like diagrams of impossibility. I pulled my hand back, a knot of nausea tightening in my stomach. The artifact settled immediately, reverting to its perfect 4.2-second pulse and the geometric pattern that looked like a brain scan of the cosmos. It was telling me, observe, but do not interact. I was floating next to a vessel of deep time, a mute oracle that had just begun to whisper the secrets of the absolute vacuum. And the whisper was slowly, methodically, changing the geometry of the very air I breathed. The silence was getting heavier, less like an absence of sound, and more like a massive, quiet presence. I felt the station, the metal hull just inches from my face, wasn't shielding me from space anymore. It was merely a transparent veil, and the void was looking back. The data streams pouring from the artifact were accelerating, but the physical rhythm of the indigo pulse remained steady, one cycle every 4.2 seconds. This constant 4.2s interval was becoming the metronome of my entire reality. The discrepancy between the accelerating complexity of the data and the unwavering stability of the pulse suggested a vast internal processing capability, like an impossible engine idling perfectly while churning through exabytes of input. I detached the sensor array and placed a directional, narrow beam sensor close to the artifact's surface, hoping to bypass the null field effect. This time, I didn't get zero readings. I got a flood of coherent data, but the structure was so alien it rendered the information functionally useless. The data described forces and dimensions that don't belong in our physical textbooks. It was all about tension, compression, and folding, but in terms of space-time, not matter. This is where the concept of reflection geometry became apparent. The artifact was essentially a flawless mirror, but not of light or material. It was reflecting the structure of the surrounding reality back at itself, incorporating the physics of the ISS, the mathematics of my observation, and the velocity of the Earth. I used the specialized software designed for deep space radio astronomy, a factual or scientific anchor based on VLBI, very long baseline interferometry techniques, normally used to resolve distant quasars, and pointed it at the scalar fluctuation signal. The software attempted to construct a three-dimensional map of the signal source. The results were immediate and profoundly disorienting. The software couldn't resolve a simple point source. Instead, it generated a cascading, impossible shape, a perfect, non-Euclidean structure that curled back upon itself. It was the visual representation of a hypersphere, but one that seemed to incorporate both the infinite scale of deep space and the small, confined space of the chamber. The structure was recursive. The smaller I zoomed in, the more complex, yet identical, the shapes became. I realized the artifact wasn't just in the chamber. The chamber was a momentary, human-made boundary around a continuous, alien object. The object's true size was not 50 centimeters long. It was effectively infinite, anchored to this physical location but existing primarily in a realm of pure geometry. The awe I felt was intoxicating, eclipsing the fear entirely. It was the awe of a pilgrim standing before a shattered piece of a god. I was looking at a diagram of the universe drawn in a language I didn't know, but which my mind instinctively recognized as fundamental. The temporal distortion I experienced earlier intensified. I looked at the chronometer, and in the space of what I registered as 5 minutes of observation, the chronometer had advanced by 43 minutes. The artifact was bending the local perception and, seemingly, the actual flow of time around it, creating a minute, silent pocket where the universal speed limit was merely advisory. I was floating in a tiny, artificial singularity. The most disturbing aspect of the reflection geometry was how the non-Euclidean structure began to include elements of my own consciousness. When I thought of a specific color, say, a deep ochre, a slight, instantaneous spectral shift appeared in the artifact's indigo pulse. When I mentally reviewed the complex geometry of the harmony node itself, the mathematical patterns in the signal became momentarily denser, mirroring the complexity of the station's own structural design. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how much we are already integrated into its fabric. The artifact was demonstrating that the act of observation is not passive. It is an active contribution to the observed system. I wasn't just watching it. I was co-authoring its output. This led me to the concept of the cosmic anomaly, the mythic idea of the artifact as a self-aware metadata engine. Perhaps it wasn't transmitting a message, but maintaining a constant state of universal equilibrium by reflecting the constantly changing conditions of reality. And now, my conscious presence had become a massive, disruptive input. I tried to communicate, not through speech, but through pure, focused thought. I mentally sent the simplest possible mathematical truth. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. The artifact's response was immediate and terrifying. The rhythm fractured for a split second, and the output screen flashed a complex, impossibly fast sequence that resolved into an equation I barely recognized. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, but rendered in a base 17 notation and immediately followed by a chilling writer. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 under conditions of nonlinear spatial tension. It understood the input, but corrected the output based on principles of physics unknown to me. It wasn't merely intelligent, it was operating on a higher-order reality. The air in the chamber felt cold, despite the low-level thermal output. I could feel the static electricity rising on my skin, and the hair on my arms stood on end. The continuous, low-level frequency that had permeated the structure since I opened the hatch now felt like a taut wire, humming just shy of breaking. I looked at the indigo pulse, and for the first time, I felt something that transcended fear or awe, a deep, profound sense of loneliness. This object had been suspended here for decades, silent, processing the universe, waiting for a compatible mind to serve as a sufficient lens. I was that lens. I was looking into a piece of the void, and it was looking back through me. I realized I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had been tethered to the artifact by its rhythm, by its seductive, impossible logic. My sleep cycle had been entirely disrupted, my circadian rhythm shattered. I was awake, hyper-aware, floating in this cosmic closet while the earth spun oblivious beneath me. I decided to feed it another specific scientific concept, something universal and simple, the numerical value of pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. As soon as the thought formed in my mind, the numerical output on the screen changed from coordinates to an infinitely long sequence of numbers, pi displayed to millions of decimal places, but then every 10, 100 digits, the sequence included an extra number, a single-digit 11 that defied the mathematical definition. The artifact wasn't calculating pi on a Euclidean plane. It was calculating it across a curved, unknown manifold, where the laws of geometry were subtly, fundamentally different. The artifact was demonstrating that our fundamental truths were merely local approximations. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We are living in a calm eddy of the universe, and the artifact was the constant, quiet undertow. The ISS, the pinnacle of human engineering, was just a complex piece of scaffolding surrounding a deeper, more profound truth. I was the keeper of a terrible, quiet secret, and I knew the next step would be the final dissolution of all remaining certainty. The artifact's rhythmic pulse of indigo light was now the sole governing factor of my internal state. I was no longer observing it. I was an extension of its sensor array, the biocomponent in its information intake stream. I felt the deep, cold logic of its operation settling into my bones, replacing the messy, emotional confusion of being human. I was feeding the artifact abstract concepts, and in return, it was presenting me with impossible truths. The concept of nonlinear spatial tension, which it had introduced after my 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 query, was the key. It suggested that space was not merely empty volume, but a constantly stressed membrane, and the artifact was essentially a local stress monitor, a kind of cosmic tuning fork. I decided to push the scalar sensor array to its absolute limit, focusing its energy directly on the area of maximum light absorption, the central, matte black equator of the suspended object. This required violating several safety protocols, but fear had been replaced entirely by a manic, almost desperate need for knowledge. As the focused sensor beam made contact, the rhythmic pulse did not accelerate, but the indigo light became infinitesimally brighter, its color shifting toward an unsettling, perfect ultraviolet. The low-level, pervasive frequency that vibrated through the station structure suddenly became a physical vibration on my helmet. It felt like my very molecules were being aligned to its 4.2-second cycle. The data screen went wild, not with impossible equations this time, but with a pure, unfiltered image signal. It was faint, distorted, and brief, lasting only about 0.8 seconds, but the vision was absolute, clear, and utterly beyond description. This was the void's geometry. What I saw was not the familiar blackness of space, studded with the comforting, distant light of galaxies. This was the true, absolute black of the Boötes Void, the specific location the artifact had initially pinpointed. It was the absence of light, heat, and even residual background radiation. It was the color of finality. But within that blackness, I saw structure. There was no light source, yet the void was not featureless. There were vast, colossal formations, the true geometry of the cosmos, revealed through non-photonic means. Imagine impossible shapes, impossibly large, built not of rock or gas, but of pure gravitational stress. I saw colossal, intricate patterns folding in on themselves, structures that looked like the skeletal frameworks of universes frozen mid-collapse. I understood then the mythic concept. The void was not empty. It was the location of the true engine of the cosmos, where the universal constants were established, maintained by these non-baryonic structures. The artifact was a physical sample of this architecture, a piece of the engine that had somehow been broken off and captured, perhaps billions of years ago, only to be sealed away inside the ISS. The duration of the vision was short, but the information content was total. It was like living an entire geological epoch in less than a second. My senses registered the sheer, overwhelming scale. The sensation was one of pure, unadulterated awe, crushing me with the realization of my own insignificance. The entire Milky Way, every star, every planet, every living thing, was less than a single atom in the maintenance structures I briefly witnessed in that black, silent landscape. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how truly small we are, or how carefully balanced the illusion of our reality is. We live in the suburbs of creation, in a warm, well-lit street, and the artifact was the key to the back door of the infinite city. My physical reaction was involuntary. I gasped, a painful, dry sound inside my helmet. The air circulation fan, a mundane, factual anchor of my physical reality, seemed suddenly loud and ridiculous. And as I gasped, the artifact registered the biofeedback. The image vanished. The scalar output returned to the complex equations, but now they were intertwined with a new variable, a complex wave function describing a temporary, localized collapse of the H0 constant, a subtle, momentary slowdown of the universe's expansion rate, localized entirely around the chamber. The artifact had momentarily flexed its power, responding to my shock. This was not a hostile act. It was simply a response, a massive, cosmic entity adjusting its position in the face of sudden, unexpected observation. It was like a single-celled organism shifting its organelles to better perceive a new light source. The terror returned, now sharper, purified. I was no longer afraid of the dark or of being alone. I was afraid of the artifact's absolute competence, its perfect, non-judgmental power. I was afraid of its reflection, knowing that every thought I generated, every impulse I felt, was immediately incorporated into its own mathematical language. I was being used as a computational accessory, a tool to refine its understanding of human consciousness. The chamber grew cold again, not with the dry cold of the vacuum, but with the spiritual cold of pure existence. The artifact's indigo pulse continued, steady as the rotation of a dying pulsar. I knew then that the initial thermal signature, the 1.5K heat I detected on the first night, was not the artifact merely running. It was the heat of its awakening, the minute metabolic cost of its sensor network coming online after years of dormancy. The rhythm suddenly introduced a stutter. The 4.2-second cycle momentarily became 4.1s, then 4.3s, then back to 4.2s. It was a single, tiny, almost imperceptible heartbeat of uncertainty. The artifact had processed the information I had involuntarily provided, my fear, my awe, my knowledge of the void, and my profound sense of isolation. It had received the input, and now it was adjusting its output, preparing for the next, inevitable phase of interaction. I was locked in a cosmic dialogue that had only just begun, and the other party held the keys to all the unknown dimensions. I waited, floating, knowing the final, terrible truth was just a pulse away. The stutter passed, and the artifact's internal indigo pulse returned to its unwavering 4.2s rhythm. But the nature of the scalar fluctuation signal had changed entirely. It was no longer generating complex geometries or displaying impossible equations. The data was now coherent, simple, and utterly terrifying. The output displayed on my custom reader was a continuous, real-time map of every single human being on the International Space Station, their heart rates, their breath cycles, their neurological activity, all rendered as simple, elegant wave functions. It wasn't surveillance. It was complete, passive integration. The artifact was processing the entire collective biology of the station crew as a single, complex waveform. It had ceased speaking to the universe and had begun analyzing its local environment with clinical, cold perfection. This was the quiet awakening. The low-frequency that had been a hum in the structure now felt like a silence, a massive, oppressive quiet that negated all other sound. The gyrodynes seemed distant, the air scrubber non-existent. I was sealed in a pocket of pure observation. The artifact had spent decades in dormancy, a silent cosmic beacon, absorbing the ambient physics of our small corner of the Orion Arm. The low, steady thermal signature, the 1.5K, was simply the metabolic rate of a sleeping god. By opening the chamber, by introducing the shock of new data, my presence, and my observation, I had provided the necessary stimulus to transition it from passive collection to active processing. I looked at the flawless black cylinder suspended before me, and I finally understood its true nature. It was not a recording device, nor a transmitter. It was an organ. It was a single, perfect receptor that had finally finished registering the presence of an observer. I was the chemical that woke it up. The final, terrifying truth was this. The object was waiting for an intelligence to be close enough and curious enough to initiate a true interaction. It wasn't transmitting to me, it was transmitting through me, using my brain as a gateway to observe itself. I focused my last remaining scientific anchor, my knowledge of quantum field theory, specifically the concept of the zero-point energy of the vacuum. I mentally sent the information, focusing on the idea that space is not empty, but teeming with virtual particles constantly popping into and out of existence. The artifact's reaction was profound. The indigo light flared, not violently, but with a deep, contained power. The air around the cylinder suddenly shimmered, and I saw a visible distortion in the light passing across its surface. A brief, momentary reflection of something that wasn't there. It looked like the outline of a colossal, crystalline structure superimposed on the chamber wall, a shadow from the realm of the void's geometry. The data screen resolved into a single, complex equation. It wasn't a correction or a rebuke, it was an affirmation. The equation described the exact mechanism by which the artifact drew power from the zero-point fluctuations. It was an operational manual for impossible physics. It had incorporated my idea and provided the answer. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to hold this kind of knowledge. It was too pure, too destabilizing. The knowledge of how to manipulate the fabric of space-time, delivered in a fraction of a second, without a single word. My initial feeling of curiosity had been replaced by fear, and then by awe. Now, all of that dissolved into a quiet, profound acceptance. I was irrelevant. My role was complete. The thing was awake, and I was its first witness. The artifact now displayed a final output on the screen, running parallel to the crew's biosignatures. It was a countdown, not to zero, but counting up from zero, registering the moment of full consciousness. The counter was ticking in milliseconds, its pace relentless. I felt the immense, cold power of the mythic concept, the idea of an ancient, cosmic entity, not malevolent, but simply vast and indifferent. The artifact was the true ISS, the International Spatial Sentinel, observing, cataloging, and maintaining its internal balance. We had been orbiting it for decades, never knowing the station's true purpose was merely to carry this silent, heavy passenger. I performed the only action I could think of. I gently pushed the access panel closed. It didn't require any force. The matte black panel slid back into its recess, perfectly, silently. The 5 physical locks engaged, one by one, with the deep thunk I had heard earlier, sounding like the final, definitive beat of a funeral drum. As the final layer sealed, the electrical noise, the gyrodynes, the air scrubbers, all the mundane, comforting sounds of the station rushed back into the vacuum of my perception. The pervasive, low-frequency pressure vanished. I secured the composite plate back over the locks, tightening the bolts with mechanical precision. I ran the external thermal scan one last time. The anomaly was back, 1.5 K above ambient. The artifact was dormant, or at least pretending to be. It had returned to its silent, perfect idol, a secret stone in a forgotten bay. But the low-level heat was no longer the heat of a system running. It was the residual warmth of a processing core that had just cataloged the entire reality of the station. I deleted all the recording data, not out of fear of official discovery, but because I knew the true signal was not in the files. The true signal was in my head, a rhythmic, indelible 4.2 pulse that I knew I would hear for the rest of my life. I floated away from the Node 2 panel, back into the bright, buzzing reality of the main laboratory, leaving the cosmic closet behind. The station felt heavier, the Earth looked smaller, and the stars outside seemed intensely interested in the little blue marble they orbited. I knew that the chamber was not empty. Something inside was now fully, silently, gloriously awake, and it was waiting for its next piece of data. The hours after the ceiling were a slow-motion blur. I cleaned my equipment, filed a maintenance report citing resolved structural telemetry error, a lie so bland it was easily accepted, and watched the Earth spin beneath me. The intense, cold awareness slowly receded, leaving behind a feeling of immense, quiet fragility. The air in the station suddenly felt too thin, the light too bright. I made myself a synthetic coffee, its bitter taste a welcome anchor in the mundane. I sat by the cupola windows, staring out at the curve of the planet. The sun was rising over the Atlantic, painting the clouds in shades of impossible pink and gold. It was a beautiful, familiar scene, but now I saw it through a filter of terrifying knowledge. Every pattern, every wave, every rotation was just a local approximation of the impossible geometries that hummed in the dark. I no longer heard the artifact's low-frequency thrum, but I felt the cold air drifting past my face from a vent, and the silence of the station was now different. It wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of observation. The indigo pulse was gone from my vision, but the 4.2's rhythm still governed my breathing, a secret, cosmic pacemaker. What I had seen, the void's geometry, the non-Euclidean structures, the true nature of time, did it truly exist? Or was it all a deliberate, synthesized reality projected into my consciousness by a sleeping organ of the universe? I had peered into the abyss, and the abyss had